In an age ruled by kings and empires, one group of outlaws lived by a different system, democracy. And it wasn't on land, but on pirate ships. Welcome back to the channel, where we dive deep into the untold stories of history. Today, we're exploring something that might completely change how you think about pirates forever. Picture this. It's 1715, and you're standing on the deck of a merchant vessel in the Caribbean. Suddenly, black sails appear on the horizon. Your heart races as you realize what's coming. Pirates. But here's what most people do and know about that approaching ship. It's governed more democratically than any European kingdom of the time. While King Louis XIV of France rules 20 million subjects with absolute power, that pirate crew of maybe 200 men operates under a constitution that gives every single member an equal vote. When you hear the word pirate, what comes to mind? Probably ruthless criminals sailing the seas, stealing treasure, and living without any rules or order. Hollywood has fed us images of chaotic, lawless brigands who follow only their own greed and violence. But what if I told you that pirate ships were actually some of the most democratic societies of their time? What if these so-called outlaws were actually pioneers of principles we hold dear today? Equality, representation, workers' rights, disability insurance, and fair governance. The Pirate Code wasn't just a set of rules to keep order among thieves. It was something far more revolutionary, a written constitution that established democratic principles decades before they became mainstream. While European monarchs ruled with absolute power over millions of subjects who had no say in their own governance, pirates created miniature republics on their ships where democracy was on just an ideal. It was a matter of survival. Consider this extraordinary fact. In 1720, when the British Empire encompassed millions of subjects who had no political representation whatsoever, a pirate crew of 150 men aboard Bartholomew Roberts' ship had a more representative government than the entire Kingdom of Great Britain. Every single crew member had voting rights that wouldn't be extended to common British citizens for another century. This raises a fascinating question that historians have been grappling with for decades. Could pirates have been pioneers of democracy before the modern world? Were these maritime outlaws actually ahead of their time, creating systems of government that wouldn't become mainstream for centuries? Some scholars argue that pirate democracy helped lay the groundwork for American revolutionary ideals. Others go even further, suggesting that these floating republics represented one of history's most successful experiments in direct democracy. To understand why pirate ships became floating democracies, we need to step back and examine the brutal world they emerged from. The 17th and 18th centuries were an era of absolute monarchy in Europe, where the very concept of democracy was considered dangerous radicalism. Kings ruled by divine right, claiming God himself had appointed them to wield unlimited power over their subjects. Louis XIV of France famously declared, "L'état, c'est moi. I am the state." There were no elections, no representation, no checks and balances. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. If you were born a noble, you inherited power regardless of your competence or character. This rigid hierarchy wasn't just a political system. It was a complete worldview that penetrated every aspect of society. The Great Chain of Being, as it was called, placed every person in a fixed position from birth to death. God was at the top, then angels, then kings, then nobles, then merchants, then craftsmen, then peasants, then animals. Moving between these levels was not just impossible, it was considered a sin against the natural order of creation. But nowhere was this hierarchy more brutal and inescapable than in the naval forces of European powers. The Royal Navy, the Spanish Armada, the French fleet. These were floating extensions of the monarchy's absolute rule. Miniature kingdoms where the captain wielded godlike authority over hundreds of men trapped together for months or years at sea. Life aboard a Royal Naval vessel was a nightmare that most modern people can barely imagine. Sailors were often pressed into service against their will through a system of legalized kidnapping called impressment. Press gangs would sweep through port cities, literally grabbing men off the streets and forcing them aboard warships. A man might go to sleep in his own bed and wake up hundreds of miles from shore, bound to years of service he never agreed to. These impressed sailors faced conditions that bordered on systematic torture. They were paid a pittance, when they were paid at all. Their food was often rotten, their water contaminated, their living quarters cramped and disease-ridden. They slept in hammocks packed so tightly together that when one man turned over, the entire row had to turn with him. They worked 18-hour days in all weather, hauling heavy ropes and climbing treacherous rigging while officers shouted orders from below. The punishment system aboard Royal Navy ships was designed to break men's spirits completely. Captains wielded absolute authority over their crews, with the power to order floggings, keel-haulings, or executions on nothing more than a personal whim. A sailor could be tied to the mast and whipped until his back was raw meat for crimes as trivial as talking back to an officer or being slow to follow an order. Keel-hauling, dragging a man under the ship's hull by rope, was often a death sentence disguised as punishment. There was no appeal process, no representation, no recourse. The ship's hierarchy was as rigid and unforgiving as the monarchy that commanded it. Officers lived in luxury, while common sailors were treated like disposable tools. A midshipman, who might be only 16 years old, had absolute authority over experienced sailors twice his age. Birth and connection mattered more than skill or experience. But perhaps most crushing of all was the complete absence of hope. A common sailor in the Royal Navy could serve faithfully for decades and never rise above his station. There was no democratic participation, no chance for advancement based on merit, no opportunity to improve his conditions through collective action. He was trapped in a floating prison where his only choices were obedience or death. Yet the harsh conditions of naval service created something the monarchies never expected: a revolutionary mindset among the men who worked the ships. These sailors, pressed into service and brutalized by their officers, began to dream of something radically different. In the cramped quarters below deck, they whispered of ships where every man had a voice, where captains served at the pleasure of the crew, where the spoils of victory were shared equally among all who risked their lives to earn them. These weren't just idle fantasies. Across the Caribbean, the coast of North America, and the waters around Madagascar, such ships actually existed. Pirates had created something that didn't exist anywhere else in the world: maritime societies based on democratic principles, economic equality, and individual rights. When pressed sailors finally had the chance to escape their floating prisons, through mutiny, desertion, or simply jumping ship at a friendly port, many of them didn't return to the rigid hierarchies of land-based society. Instead, they sought out pirate crews, or gathered like-minded men to form their own. They weren't just looking for treasure or adventure. They were seeking something far more precious and rare: freedom, dignity, and a voice in their own destiny. The transformation was often dramatic. A man who had been brutalized and voiceless aboard a Royal Navy vessel could find himself within weeks serving on a pirate ship where his opinion mattered as much as anyone else's. Former slaves discovered that their skin color didn't determine their status. Religious minorities found that their beliefs were respected rather than persecuted. Political dissidents discovered communities where questioning authority wasn't treason, it was expected. Pirate ships became magnets for every type of person who had been crushed under the heel of absolute authority. Former naval sailors made up the largest group, bringing with them intimate knowledge of seamanship and naval tactics. But they were joined by escaped indentured servants fleeing years of unpaid labor, runaway slaves seeking freedom that existed nowhere else in the Americas, religious refugees escaping persecution, political dissidents avoiding prosecution, and economic refugees driven from their homes by poverty and oppression. This diversity wasn't just tolerated, it was essential to pirate success. A typical pirate crew in the 1720s might include English sailors, French Huguenots, German immigrants, freed African slaves, Native Americans, Portuguese merchants, and Dutch craftsmen, all working together as equals. This level of integration wouldn't be matched in legitimate society for centuries. When these diverse groups of people came together aboard pirate ships, they faced a fundamental challenge. How could men from such different backgrounds, with such different experiences of authority and governance, work together effectively? The answer they developed was democracy. Not because they were political philosophers, but because it was the only system that could function in their unique circumstances. The foundation of pirate democracy was elegantly simple but revolutionary for its time. Every man aboard the ship had an equal say in how it was run. This wasn't just a nice ideal scribbled in some theoretical document. It was codified in formal agreements that historians call pirate codes or articles of agreement. These weren't just lists of rules and punishments. They were constitutions, carefully crafted to ensure that power was distributed fairly and that no single person could become a tyrant. These articles were typically negotiated and agreed upon before a new crew set sail, with every potential member having input into their creation. They covered everything from the division of treasure to the resolution of disputes, from the duties of officers to the rights of ordinary crew members. Most importantly, they established the democratic processes by which the ship would be governed. The most fundamental aspect of pirate democracy was the election of the captain. In every other maritime organization of the time, captains were appointed from above, by naval commanders representing the crown, by shipping company owners seeking profit, or by colonial governors exercising royal authority. Their legitimacy flowed downward from the established power structure, and their authority was backed by the full force of the state. But pirate captains derived their authority from below, chosen by the very men they would lead. This wasn't a ceremonial process or a rubber stamp approval of a predetermined choice. These elections were serious democratic exercises where candidates had to make their case to the crew, explaining their qualifications, their strategic vision, and their commitment to the ship's articles. Crews evaluated potential captains based on multiple criteria. Seamanship was obviously crucial. A captain who couldn't navigate or handle the ship in a storm would get everyone killed. Fighting ability mattered too, since pirates lived by violence and needed leaders who could hold their own in battle. Strategic thinking was essential for planning raids and avoiding capture. But perhaps most importantly, crews looked for character. Men who would honor the ship's articles, treat the crew fairly, and resist the temptation to become tyrants. The famous pirate Captain Bartholomew Roberts provides a perfect example of how this democratic process worked. Born John Roberts in Wales, he was serving as third mate aboard a slave ship when it packed was captured by pirates in 1719. The pirate crew that captured his ship was already operating under democratic principles. and when their captain was killed in battle just 6 weeks later, they held an election to choose his replacement. Roberts had been with the crew for only 6 weeks, but he won the election decisively. Why? The crew recognized his exceptional seamanship, his natural leadership ability, and his commitment to fair dealing. More importantly, they trusted him to uphold their democratic system rather than trying to transform himself into an absolute ruler. Roberts proved their trust well-founded. Over the next 3 years, he became one of the most successful pirates in history, capturing over 400 ships while maintaining the democratic principles that had brought him to power. His cruise articles, which have survived to the present day, represent one of the most sophisticated documents of democratic governance from the 18th century. But pirate democracy didn't stop with the captain. The second most important position on a pirate ship was the quartermaster, and this role embodied one of the most sophisticated aspects of pirate governance: the separation of powers. This concept, that authority should be divided among different offices to prevent tyranny, wouldn't be fully developed in legitimate political theory for decades. Yet pirates were putting it into practice out of practical necessity. While the captain had absolute authority during battles, navigation, and other technical aspects of sailing, the quartermaster controlled almost everything else about daily life aboard the ship. This division wasn't arbitrary. It reflected the different skills required for different aspects of ship management and created a natural system of checks and balances. The quartermaster was responsible for distributing food and water, maintaining discipline during non-combat situations, settling disputes between crew members, leading boarding parties during attacks, and most importantly, dividing the treasure according to the ship's articles. This wasn't just an administrative role. It was a check on the captain's power designed to prevent the abuse of authority. A captain might be brilliant in battle and exceptional at navigation, but if he tried to cheat the crew out of their fair share of the loot, the quartermaster had both the authority and the responsibility to stop him. Conversely, a quartermaster who tried to abuse his control over daily life could be overruled by the captain during dangerous situations. Both officers served at the pleasure of the crew and could be voted out if they failed to serve the ship's collective interests. This system of checks and balances was remarkably sophisticated for its time, anticipating by decades the constitutional principles that would later govern democratic nations. The captain couldn't become a dictator because the quartermaster controlled the crew's material well-being. The quartermaster couldn't abuse his power because the captain retained ultimate authority in life-or-death situations, and both officers remained accountable to the democratic will of the crew. The crew's democratic authority extended far beyond just choosing their officers. Every major decision aboard a pirate ship was put to a collective vote. Where should they sail next? Should they attack a particular target or let it pass? How should they respond to an offer of pardon from colonial authorities? What punishment should be imposed on a crew member who violated the ship's articles? These weren't decisions made by a single authority figure, as they would be on a Royal Navy vessel or in a European kingdom. They were collective choices, made by democratic consensus. The phrase, "one man, one vote," might sound like a modern democratic slogan, but it was the lived reality aboard pirate ships 3 centuries ago. Every crew member, regardless of his background, his race, his religion, or his social status before joining the ship, had an equal voice in decisions that affected his life. This was extraordinary for its time, when the vast majority of people in the world had no political voice whatsoever. Consider the stunning contrast with legitimate society of the era. In 18th century England, the most politically advanced nation in Europe, only wealthy landowners could vote in parliamentary elections. This represented perhaps 3% of the population. The other 97%, farmers, laborers, craftsmen, servants, women, religious minorities, had no say whatsoever in their government. In France, the absolute monarchy didn't even pretend to seek the consent of the governed. The king's word was law, period, and questioning that word was literally treason. Yet aboard pirate ships, every man had an equal vote in decisions that directly affected his life, his livelihood, and his future. A former slave had the same voice as a former naval officer. A young sailor on his first voyage had the same vote as an experienced sea dog who had been pirating for decades. A Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, and a Muslim could all participate equally in the ship's democratic processes. The democratic principles of pirate ships extended far beyond just voting procedures. Pirates developed sophisticated systems of what we would now call social welfare and workers' rights that were centuries ahead of their time. The ship's articles typically specified exactly how treasure would be divided among the crew, and these divisions were remarkably egalitarian compared to other institutions of the period. A typical pirate ship might allocate treasure shares as follows. The captain received 2 shares. The quartermaster, and other key officers, like the boatswain, gunner, navigator, received 1.5 shares each, and every regular crew member received 1 full share. This meant that a common sailor on a pirate ship received only half as much as his captain. A far cry from Royal Navy vessels, where officers might live in luxury while common sailors barely survived on meager rations and tiny wages that were often paid months or years late, if at all. But even more remarkable than the relatively equal distribution of wealth was the comprehensive system of insurance and workers' compensation that pirates developed. These men were engaging in one of the most dangerous occupations in the world, facing death from drowning, disease, battle, and accident on a daily basis. They responded by creating what might be the world's first comprehensive disability insurance system. The ship's articles typically included detailed provisions for crew members who were injured in the line of duty. These weren't vague promises of help. They were specific, legally binding commitments that were enforced by the democratic will of the crew. A pirate who lost a leg in battle might receive 400 pieces of 8 from the common fund. The loss of an arm was worth 300 pieces. The loss of an eye might be compensated with 100 pieces, while the loss of a finger was worth 50. These payments weren't charity or goodwill gestures. They were rights guaranteed by the ship's constitution and backed by the collective power of the crew. A disabled pirate didn't have to beg for help or depend on the kindness of his former shipmates. He had a legal claim on the ship's resources that was just as valid as any officer's share of the treasure. Compare this progressive system to the treatment of disabled sailors in the royal navies of Europe. A sailor who lost a limb in service to his king might receive a small pension, if he was extraordinarily lucky and had friends in high places. More often, he was simply discharged with whatever back pay was owed him, and left to beg on the streets or depend on family charity. There was no guaranteed compensation, no systematic care for those who had sacrificed their bodies for their country. No recognition that society owed anything to men who had been broken in its service. The contrast becomes even more stark when we consider that Royal Navy sailors were often impressed into service against their will, while pirates had chosen their dangerous profession voluntarily. Yet the involuntary sailors received no guaranteed care when they were injured, while the voluntary pirates had comprehensive insurance systems that modern workers would recognize and envy. Pirates also pioneered concepts of workplace safety and reasonable working conditions that wouldn't become widespread in legitimate industries for centuries. Many ships' articles included provisions for regular rest periods, limits on the captain's authority to impose punishments, and requirements for adequate food and water. Some even included what might be the first written guarantees of religious freedom in the New World. The democratic nature of pirate ships attracted people from all walks of life who had been denied opportunity in legitimate society. This was particularly true for people of African descent, both free and enslaved. While slavery was legal and widespread throughout the European colonies of the Americas, pirate ships often operated as integrated communities where a man's worth was measured by his contribution to the crew, not the color of his skin. The contrast was striking and important. In the plantation societies of the Caribbean and North America, racial hierarchy was enforced by law and violence. Africans and their descendants were considered property, with no legal rights and no hope of advancement. Even free people of color faced severe restrictions on their movement, their economic activities, and their civil rights. But aboard pirate ships, former slaves could and did rise to positions of authority based on their merit and the democratic support of their crewmates. Black Caesar, who operated his own pirate crew in the Florida Keys for years, commanded both black and white followers. Diego Grillo became quartermaster of a major pirate crew. Many other men of African descent served as gunners, navigators, and boatswains, positions of real responsibility and authority. This wasn't just tokenism or exceptional cases. Historical records suggest that people of African descent made up 15 to 20% of many pirate crews, a level of integration that wouldn't be matched in most legitimate institutions for centuries. More importantly, they participated fully in the democratic processes of their ships. They voted in elections, they shared equally in treasure divisions, and they were subject to the same laws and punishments as everyone else. Women, too, found opportunities in pirate society that were denied to them elsewhere. While they remained a small minority, the dangerous and cramped conditions of pirate ships were unconducive to large numbers of women. Those who did join pirate crews often achieved remarkable success and recognition. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the most famous female pirates, but they weren't unique. Historical records mention dozens of women who served aboard pirate ships in various capacities. Some disguised themselves as men to join crews. Others served openly as women. Some were fighters who participated in battles. Others were navigators, quartermasters, or even captains. What's most important about these women isn't just that they existed, but how they were treated by their male crewmates. Rather than being marginalized or exploited, successful female pirates were respected members of their crews who earned their places through competence and courage. They received equal shares of treasure, participated fully in crew decisions, and were held to the same standards as male pirates. This equality wasn't just theoretical or symbolic. When Anne Bonny and Mary Read were captured and tried for piracy in 1720, the testimony at their trial makes clear that they had been full participants in their crew's activities. They had fought in battles, they had voted on targets and tactics, they had shared equally in the crew's profits. Their male crewmates testified that they were valued and respected members of the ship's company. Compare this to the situation of women in legitimate society of the time. In most European legal systems, women were considered the property of their fathers or husbands, with no independent legal rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't own property in their own names, couldn't enter into contracts, and had no say in government. A woman who tried to engage in business or politics was considered unnatural and dangerous. Yet, aboard pirate ships, women who proved their worth could achieve levels of autonomy, authority, and respect that were impossible anywhere else in their world. This wasn't because pirates were necessarily more enlightened about gender equality. It was because their democratic systems were based on contribution and competence rather than birth and social convention. The religious tolerance of pirate communities was also remarkable for its time. The 17th and 18th centuries were an era of devastating religious wars in Europe. Catholics and Protestants slaughtered each other by the hundreds of thousands. Jews faced persecution and expulsion from many countries. Muslims and Christians fought brutal conflicts across the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. But pirate crews typically included members of all these faiths, working together peacefully and effectively. Catholics from France and Spain served alongside Protestants from England and Holland. Jewish merchants who had been expelled from European ports found welcome aboard pirate ships. Muslim converts and African spiritual practitioners participated as equals in crew decisions. This practical tolerance emerged from necessity rather than philosophical conviction. Pirates couldn't afford to waste time and energy on religious conflicts, when they needed every man to work together for the ship's survival. But it created communities that were far more diverse and tolerant than any legitimate society of their era. Many ships' articles included explicit guarantees of religious freedom, stating that every man could worship as he chose without interference from officers or crewmates. This principle, that religious belief was a matter of individual conscience rather than state control, wouldn't be widely accepted in European societies for generations. The contrast between pirate democracy and the rigid monarchies of Europe becomes even more dramatic. When we examine specific historical examples, take the famous pirate Captain Bartholomew Roberts, whose ship's articles have survived to the present day. These articles, formally agreed to by his entire crew, established a comprehensive system of democratic governance that was more progressive than most modern democracies. Roberts' articles established the crew's absolute right to vote on all matters of major importance to the ship. They guaranteed every man's right to a fair share of food, water, and alcohol. They prohibited gambling and games of chance that might cause disputes among the crew. They established quiet hours from 8 in the evening to 8 in the morning to ensure everyone could get adequate rest. They even included what might be the first written guarantee of religious freedom on the high seas, stating that every man could worship according to his own conscience without interference. The articles also established a comprehensive system of justice and discipline. Rather than depending on the arbitrary will of the captain, punishments were specified in advance and applied equally to all crew members regardless of rank. A man who deserted his post during battle faced death. A man who disobeyed orders during combat faced marooning. A man who struck another crew member faced the loss of his right hand. But these punishments could only be imposed after a trial before the entire crew, with the accused having the right to defend himself and call witnesses. Perhaps most remarkably, Roberts' articles included provisions for what we would now call democratic oversight of leadership. The captain and quartermaster could be removed from office at any time by a majority vote of the crew. New officers could be elected whenever necessary. No decision of major importance could be made without consulting the crew's collective will. These weren't the chaotic rules of a criminal organization. They were the carefully considered laws of a floating republic, designed to ensure that power was shared fairly and that every member of the community was treated with dignity and respect. They represented centuries of collective wisdom about how to create just and effective governance under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Meanwhile, in the kingdoms of Europe that hunted these pirate ships, Subjects had no guaranteed rights whatsoever. A king could seize a man's property without compensation, conscript his sons for military service, or execute him without trial. There was no Bill of Rights, no constitutional protections, no democratic recourse. The king's will was absolute law, and questioning that will was treason punishable by death. The economic system of pirate ships was also far more equitable than anything found in European kingdoms or their American colonies. While monarchs extracted wealth from their subjects through taxes, tribute, and forced labor, pirates operated on a system of shared risk and shared reward. Every man aboard the ship had invested his life in their collective enterprise, and every man received a fair portion of whatever they earned together. This wasn't just about treasure seized from captured ships, though that was certainly part of it. Pirates also engaged in what we might call legitimate business activities. They offered protection services to merchant vessels in exchange for payment. They established their own trading posts in remote locations where they could buy and sell goods without interference from colonial authorities. Some pirate crews even engaged in privateering, essentially piracy with government authorization. During times of war, all of these profits, regardless of their source, were shared democratically among the crew according to the ship's articles. The system was transparent, predictable, and fair. Every man knew exactly what his share would be before any venture began. There were no hidden fees, no arbitrary deductions, no favoritism based on personal relationships with the officers. The fairness of pirate economics stood in sharp contrast to the extractive systems of European monarchies and their colonial empires. In legitimate society, wealth flowed upward from the many to the few. Peasants and laborers produced the wealth that supported aristocratic luxury. Sailors and soldiers risked their lives for a pittance, while their officers lived comfortably on inherited wealth and political connections. Colonial economies were particularly exploitative. Plantation owners accumulated vast fortunes through the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans. Merchants extracted profits from trade networks built on colonial exploitation. Colonial governors enriched themselves through corruption and the sale of offices. Meanwhile, the people who actually produced the wealth, slaves, indentured servants, small farmers, sailors, received little or nothing for their labor. But aboard pirate ships, those who took the risks reaped the rewards. The system was imperfect. Pirates were still criminals who made their living through theft and violence. But within their own communities, they created economic arrangements that were far more just and equitable than anything available in legitimate society. Some historians have argued that pirate democracy had a direct influence on the development of democratic ideals in the American colonies. This isn't just speculation. There are documented connections between pirate communities and the political leaders who would later lead the American Revolution. Many former pirates settled in coastal communities throughout the American colonies, bringing their experiences of democratic governance with them. Charleston, New York, Newport, and other colonial ports had significant populations of former pirates who had taken advantage of various amnesty programs to return to legitimate society. These men carried with them practical knowledge of how democratic institutions could work, even in challenging circumstances. Some colonial leaders had direct experience with pirate democracy. Benjamin Franklin, for example, was fascinated by pirate society and wrote extensively about their systems of shared authority and collective decision-making. He saw parallels between pirate articles and the kinds of voluntary associations that he believed were essential to democratic governance. Thomas Paine's ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty echo principles that had been practiced aboard pirate ships for generations. The concept that legitimate government derives its authority from the consent of the governed, rather than from divine appointment or hereditary right, was a lived reality in pirate communities decades before it became a revolutionary slogan. The Declaration of Independence itself contains language that would have been familiar to any pirate who had helped write his ship's articles. The idea that all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights was revolutionary in legitimate political thought, but it was old news to men who had lived and worked in pirate communities, where such principles were taken for granted. The parallels between pirate articles and early American democratic documents are too numerous and specific to be mere coincidence. Both emphasized individual rights and collective decision-making. Both included systems of checks and balances to prevent the abuse of power. Both were created by communities of people who had rejected the arbitrary authority of distant kings. Both represented experiments in democratic governance by people who had experienced firsthand the crushing weight of absolute monarchy. The influence of pirate democracy on American constitutional thought is particularly evident in the concept of separation of powers. The idea that executive, legislative, and judicial functions should be divided among different institutions to prevent tyranny was central to both pirate governance and the American constitutional system. Just as pirate crews balanced the authority of captains against quartermasters and the democratic will of the crew, the American founders balanced executive, legislative, and judicial power to prevent any one branch from dominating the others. This was on just a theoretical principle borrowed from political philosophers. It was a practical system that had been tested and refined in pirate communities throughout the Caribbean. The American Revolution itself can be seen as following a pirate model in some ways. Like pirate crews, the American colonists were rejecting the arbitrary authority of a distant monarch. Like pirates, they were creating new institutions based on democratic consent rather than hereditary right. Like pirate communities, they were experimenting with forms of governance that emphasized individual rights and collective decision-making. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize pirate society too much or ignore its obvious limitations. These were still violent, criminal organizations that made their living through theft, extortion, and murder. Pirates could be extraordinarily cruel to their enemies, and their democratic principles typically didn't extend to their victims. A pirate crew might vote democratically about whether to torture prisoners for information, or how to divide the spoils taken from a captured ship whose crew they had just slaughtered. Pirates were also products of their time in many ways. While they were progressive on issues like democracy, economic equality, and racial integration, they were still 18th-century men with 18th-century attitudes about many things. Female pirates were remarkable exceptions rather than the norm. Religious tolerance was practical rather than philosophical. Democratic participation was limited to crew members. Captives, slaves being transported on captured ships, and enemy sailors had no rights whatsoever. But within their own communities, pirates created something remarkable and historically significant: functioning democracies that provided their members with rights, opportunities, and dignity that were unavailable anywhere else in their world. They proved that ordinary people, sailors, laborers, outcasts, and refugees could govern themselves effectively without kings or nobles telling them what to do. They also proved that democratic principles could work even under the most challenging circumstances. Pirate ships operated in a hostile environment where they were hunted by every legitimate navy in the world. They had no fixed territory, no stable population, no external support systems. Yet they managed to create and maintain democratic institutions that lasted for decades and influenced political development throughout the Atlantic world. The democratic traditions of pirate ships had a lasting impact on popular culture and political thought that extends far beyond their direct influence on American revolutionary ideology. The image of pirates as rebels against oppressive authority resonated with later generations of Americans who saw themselves as inheritors of that rebellious spirit. From the Boston Tea Party to the Western frontier, Americans celebrated the idea of ordinary people standing up to distant, arbitrary authority. The pirate became a powerful symbol in American culture, not just as a criminal or adventurer, but as a representative of democratic values and individual freedom. This cultural influence can be seen in everything from literature to political rhetoric. Writers like James Fenimore Cooper and Robert Louis Stevenson popularized romanticized versions of pirate life that emphasized their democratic and egalitarian aspects. Political leaders from Andrew Jackson to Theodore Roosevelt invoked pirate imagery when they wanted to portray themselves as champions of common people against established elites. Hollywood movies and popular entertainment have continued this tradition, often portraying pirates as embodiments of freedom and democracy sailing the seas beyond the reach of oppressive governments. While these portrayals often exaggerate or romanticize historical reality, they capture something true about the appeal of pirate society. It offered an alternative to the rigid hierarchies that dominated most of human history. The influence of pirate democracy can be seen in American political culture to this day. The idea that leadership should be earned rather than inherited, that power should be limited by law rather than exercised arbitrarily, that ordinary people are capable of governing themselves. These principles, which seem obvious to us now, were radical innovations when pirates first put them into practice on the high seas. Modern research has revealed just how sophisticated and durable pirate governance could be. Archaeological evidence from pirate strongholds like Nassau, Port Royal, and Tortuga shows complex, organized communities with their own courts, markets, civil institutions, and systems of law enforcement. These were unjust, temporary criminal hideouts. They were functioning societies with their own democratic traditions and constitutional principles. The Pirate Republic of Nassau, established in the Bahamas in the early 18th century, operated as an independent democracy for nearly 20 years. It had an elected council, written laws that protected the rights of all residents, courts that administered justice according to established procedures, and a militia that defended the community against external threats. At its peak, Nassau was home to over 2,000 pirates and their families, making it one of the largest democratic communities in the New World. The fact that Nassau lasted as long as it did, and that it took a massive military expedition organized by the British Empire to finally destroy it, suggests just how successful pirate democracy could be when given the chance to develop. The British correctly understood that places like Nassau represented an existential threat to the principle of royal authority. Every successful pirate republic was a demonstration that ordinary people could govern themselves without kings, nobles, or established churches. Pirates also pioneered ideas about international law and neutrality that wouldn't become mainstream for generations. Many pirate communities declared themselves neutral in the wars between European powers, claiming the right to trade with all nations, regardless of their official alliances. This concept of neutrality, that small communities should be able to maintain their independence from great power conflicts, was revolutionary in an era when monarchs claimed the right to control all trade and commerce within their spheres of influence. The pirate tradition of offering asylum to political and religious refugees also prefigured later American ideals about individual freedom and human rights. Pirate crews included religious dissidents fleeing persecution, political rebels escaping prosecution, escaped slaves seeking freedom, and economic refugees driven from their homes by poverty and oppression. These diverse communities had to develop principles of tolerance and inclusion that were far ahead of their time. Some pirate communities even experimented with what we might call early forms of social democracy. The pirate settlement of Libertalia, established on the island of Madagascar by Captain James Misson in the 1690s, reportedly operated according to principles that anticipated modern socialist thought by more than a century. According to contemporary accounts, Libertalia abolished private property in land, established collective ownership of ships and equipment, and organized production according to the principle of from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. While some historians question whether Libertalia actually existed as described, or whether it was a fictional creation designed to illustrate radical political ideas. The fact that such stories circulated widely suggests that pirate communities were seen as laboratories for alternative forms of social and economic organization. The religious and philosophical dimensions of pirate democracy were equally revolutionary for their time. While European societies were torn apart by religious wars and sectarian violence, pirate communities developed practical solutions to the challenges of religious diversity that wouldn't be widely adopted for centuries. Many ship articles included explicit guarantees that every man could practice his religion freely, without interference from officers or crewmates. This was unjust theoretical tolerance. It was a practical necessity for crews that included Catholics from France and Spain, Protestants from England and Holland, Jews fleeing persecution in Europe, Muslims from North Africa, and practitioners of various African spiritual traditions. The pirate approach to religious diversity was pragmatic rather than philosophical. They didn't develop elaborate theories about religious freedom or natural rights. Instead, they recognized that religious conflicts would destroy the cooperation essential for their survival. A crew that spent its time fighting over theological differences would be easy prey for naval patrols or rival pirate gangs. This practical tolerance created something unprecedented in the 8th century world. Genuinely multicultural communities where people of different faiths, races, and nationalities worked together as equals. The contrast with contemporary European societies, where religious minorities faced persecution, exile, or death, was stark and significant. Pirates also developed innovative approaches to education and knowledge sharing that reflected their democratic values. Since successful piracy required complex skills, navigation, gunnery, seamanship, languages, and knowledge of local conditions, pirate crews had strong incentives to share knowledge freely among all members. Many pirate ships maintained libraries of navigation charts, coastal pilots, and technical manuals that were available to any crew member who could read. Experienced pirates taught younger men the skills they needed to advance. Former naval officers shared their technical knowledge with men who had never had access to formal education. This emphasis on education and skill development was another way that pirate society differed from the rigid hierarchies of legitimate institutions. In royal navies, knowledge was hoarded by officers who used their monopoly on technical information to maintain their authority over common sailors. But pirates recognized that the ship's survival depended on having as many skilled men as possible.
The democratic culture of pirate ships also fostered innovation and experimentation in ways that more hierarchical institutions could unmatch. When every crew member had a voice in decisions, new ideas could come from anywhere. A former slave might suggest a tactical innovation. A young sailor might propose a more efficient way to organize the ship's operations. A converted merchant might know about new trading opportunities. This openness to innovation helped explain why pirate ships were often more effective than their opponents. Naval commanders, bound by rigid regulations and hierarchical traditions, found it difficult to adapt to new circumstances or adopt new tactics. But pirate crews could modify their approach quickly and creatively when faced with new challenges. The speed of decision-making on democratic pirate ships was another advantage over more hierarchical institutions. While naval commanders had to send messages up and down complex chains of command, pirate crews could reach collective decisions quickly through established democratic procedures. This agility was crucial in the fast-moving world of maritime conflict. Pirates also pioneered concepts of international maritime law that are still relevant today. Many pirate codes included detailed rules about the treatment of prisoners, the division of captured property, and the conduct of negotiations with enemy ships. While these rules were often ignored when it came to dealing with victims, they established precedents for the idea that even warfare should be conducted according to agreed-upon standards. The concept of quarter, sparing the lives of enemies who surrendered, was more consistently practiced by some pirate crews than by many legitimate navies of the time. Pirates had practical reasons for this. Crews that surrendered without fighting were more likely to be recruited as new members, and ships that surrendered intact were more valuable prizes than vessels damaged by prolonged battles. Some historians argue that pirate practices influenced the development of modern international humanitarian law. The idea that combatants have rights that must be respected, even in warfare, that civilians should be protected from military violence, and that there are limits to what even enemies can do to each other. These principles were foreshadowed in some pirate codes. Decades before they appeared in formal international agreements. The economic innovations of pirate society were equally significant. Pirates developed sophisticated systems of insurance, investment, and profit sharing that anticipated many features of modern capitalism. The joint stock arrangement used by many pirate crews, where every member invested his labor and received shares in proportion to his contribution, was similar to modern corporate structures. Pirates also pioneered forms of venture capitalism. Successful captains would sometimes invest their profits in multiple ships, diversifying their risks and expanding their operations. They developed networks of suppliers, informants, and customers that spanned the Atlantic world. They created informal banking systems that allowed them to transfer funds between distant ports without relying on official financial institutions. The entrepreneurial culture of pirate society encouraged individual initiative in ways that were rare in the more regulated economies of European kingdoms. A smart, ambitious pirate could advance rapidly based on his contributions to the crew's success. There were no guild restrictions, no hereditary barriers, no religious tests that prevented talented people from pursuing economic opportunities. This economic dynamism had broader cultural implications. Pirates developed a distinctive ethos that celebrated personal achievement, individual freedom, and democratic participation. The pirate way of life became a cultural model that influenced thinking about economics, politics, and social organization throughout the Atlantic world. The decline of piracy in the mid-18th century didn't end the influence of pirate democracy. As colonial governments offered amnesty programs to former pirates, thousands of these men returned to legitimate society, bringing their experiences of democratic governance with them. They settled in coastal communities throughout the Americas, where they became merchants, ship captains, craftsmen, and political leaders. These former pirates often became advocates for democratic reform in their new communities. They had lived and worked in societies where every voice mattered, where leaders were chosen by merit rather than birth, and where economic rewards were distributed fairly among those who earned them. When they encountered the hierarchical, undemocratic institutions of colonial society. Many of them became natural critics and reformers. The influence of former pirates on American political development may have been more significant than historians have generally recognized. In port cities like Charleston, New York, and Newport, former pirates made up substantial portions of the merchant and artisan classes. They brought with them attitudes about democracy, economic fairness, and individual rights that would later contribute to revolutionary sentiment. Some specific connections can be documented. Samuel Bellamy, one of the most famous pirate captains of the early 18th century, was from Cape Cod in Massachusetts. When his pirate career ended, some of his former crew members returned to New England, where they became part of the community that would later produce leaders of the American Revolution. The cultural impact of pirate democracy extended far beyond direct political influence. Pirates created a new social type, the self-made man who rose through merit rather than birth, who valued individual freedom over social conformity, and who was willing to challenge established authority when it became oppressive or corrupt. This pirate archetype became deeply embedded in American cultural mythology. The frontier hero, the self-reliant entrepreneur, the democratic politician who appeals directly to the common people. All of these American cultural types owe something to the pirate tradition. The influence can be seen in American language as well. Phrases like "dead men tell no tales," "splice the main brace," and "batten down the hatches" entered common usage through pirate culture. More importantly, concepts like equal shares, fair play, and majority rule were popularized and legitimized, partly through the example of pirate democracy. Pirates also contributed to the development of American ideas about masculinity and heroism. The pirate captain, who led by consensus rather than command, who shared dangers and rewards equally with his men, and who stood up to oppressive authority regardless of the odds. This became a model for American leadership that influenced everyone, from military commanders to business leaders to politicians. The environmental impact of pirate communities also deserves attention. Unlike the plantation economies that dominated legitimate colonial society, pirate communities typically had much smaller environmental footprints. They didn't clear vast areas of forest for agricultural export. They didn't maintain large populations of enslaved laborers, and they didn't extract resources for distant markets. Instead, pirate communities practiced what we might call sustainable subsistence. They harvested what they needed from local environments without exhausting resources. They maintained smaller populations that could live comfortably within the carrying capacity of their environments. They developed detailed knowledge of local ecosystems that helped them survive in remote locations. This isn't to say that pirates were early environmentalists in any conscious sense, but their way of life was inherently more sustainable than the extractive colonial economies that surrounded them. They provided an alternative model of how human communities could relate to their natural environments. The technological innovations that emerged from pirate communities were also significant. Pirates were among the first to adopt new navigational instruments, sailing techniques, and ship designs that improved their effectiveness. They experimented with new types of weapons, communication systems, and organizational methods that were later adopted by legitimate navies. The famous Pirate Route, the trading route that connected the Caribbean with the Indian Ocean via the tip of Africa, required navigational skills and geographical knowledge that pushed the boundaries of 18th century seamanship. Pirates who successfully completed these voyages contributed to the expansion of global knowledge about wind patterns, ocean currents, and coastal conditions.
Pirates also played important roles in the development of cartography. Their detailed knowledge of remote coasts, hidden harbors, and dangerous reefs was valuable to anyone trying to create accurate maps. Some former pirates became professional pilots and chart makers, contributing their expertise to the improvement of maritime navigation. As we look back on the Golden Age of Piracy from our modern perspective, it becomes clear that these maritime outlaws were conducting one of history's most significant experiments in democratic governance. While European monarchs ruled through fear, tradition, and divine right, Pirates created societies based on consent, equality, and shared responsibility. The success of pirate democracy under such challenging conditions, operating without fixed territory, hunted by every legitimate government, facing constant dangers from weather, disease, and warfare, demonstrates the practical viability of democratic principles even in extreme circumstances. Pirates proved that democracy wasn't just a philosophical ideal or a luxury that only wealthy, educated societies could afford. It was a practical system of governance that could create more just, more effective, and more resilient communities than the alternatives available at the time. The lessons of pirate democracy remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with questions of governance, equality, and justice. Pirates showed that ordinary people from diverse backgrounds can work together effectively when given equal voice and equal stake in their common enterprise. They demonstrated that leadership should be earned through competence and character rather than inherited through birth or appointment from above. They also showed that economic systems can be designed to reward contribution and effort rather than simply concentrating wealth in the hands of those who already have power. The pirate principle that those who take the risks should reap the rewards offers an alternative to both the feudal hierarchies of the past and the extreme inequalities of modern capitalism. Perhaps most importantly, pirates proved that alternatives to oppressive systems are possible. When existing institutions failed to serve people's needs for dignity, opportunity, and fair treatment, new institutions can be created. The example of pirate democracy shows that even the most disadvantaged and marginalized people can organize themselves to create better lives and more just communities. The story of pirate democracy also reminds us that progress isn't always linear or predictable. Some of history's most important innovations in governance and human rights came not from established institutions or recognized leaders, but from desperate people seeking alternatives to oppression and injustice. The pirates who created floating republics in the Caribbean weren't trying to change the world or advance the cause of human freedom in any abstract sense. They were simply trying to create better lives for themselves and their shipmates. But in doing so, they pioneered principles of governance that would eventually transform civilization. Their example suggests that social change often begins at the margins, among people who have been excluded from or failed by existing systems. The innovations they develop out of necessity can eventually spread to mainstream society, creating new possibilities for human organization and cooperation. As we face our own challenges with democracy, inequality, and social justice, the example of pirate society offers both inspiration and practical lessons. These maritime rebels proved that democratic principles can work under the most challenging circumstances, that diversity can be a source of strength rather than division, and that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when given the opportunity. The pirates of the Golden Age were indeed criminals who lived by theft and violence. But they were also pioneers who created some of history's most successful experiments in democratic governance. They stole treasure from merchant ships, but they also created something far more valuable: the knowledge that free societies are possible, that equality is achievable, and that alternatives to oppression can be built by anyone brave enough to try. In their floating republics, surrounded by hostile empires and facing constant danger, they proved that democracy isn't just about voting procedures or constitutional documents. It's about creating communities where everyone has dignity, everyone has opportunity, and everyone has a voice in shaping their common destiny. When the last pirate strongholds finally fell to imperial forces, their democratic experiments didn't end. They transformed and spread. The principles they had practiced and perfected aboard their ships influenced revolutions and reforms throughout the Atlantic world, contributing to the eventual triumph of democratic ideals over monarchical absolutism. Today, as we continue to struggle with the challenges of building just and equitable societies, we might do well to remember the lessons learned aboard pirate ships centuries ago. They remind us that democracy is not a gift granted by benevolent rulers, but an achievement won by ordinary people who refuse to accept that oppression and inequality are inevitable. They show us that true democracy requires more than just political rights. It demands economic fairness, social equality, and genuine respect for human dignity. Most importantly, they prove that such societies are not just theoretical possibilities, but practical achievements that can be built wherever people have the courage and determination to create them. The skull and crossbones that flew from pirate masts wasn't just a symbol of death and danger. It was a declaration of independence from the hierarchical world that had failed so many people. It announced that here, on this ship, different rules applied. Here, every person mattered. Here, democracy was not just an ideal, but a lived reality. They were hunted as criminals, but in their floating republics, pirates lived freer than the kings who condemned them. That freedom, and the democratic principles that made it possible, became their greatest treasure, one that continues to inspire people seeking justice and equality around the world. If you found this exploration of pirate democracy fascinating, you'll love our next deep dive into maritime history. Join me next time as we decode the hidden meanings behind pirate flags, exploring how these symbols of rebellion communicated complex messages across the seas, from the infamous Jolly Roger to the personal banners of legendary captains. We'll uncover the secret language that pirates used to intimidate enemies, identify allies, and declare their independence from the kingdoms that hunted them. We'll discover how these simple pieces of cloth became powerful tools of psychological warfare, diplomatic communication, and cultural identity. Until then, keep questioning what you think you know about history. The truth is always more fascinating than the myths we've been told.